Well, I'm going to talk about cash rental rates in Kansas and kind of what the future holds. Like Robin's mentioned in her presentation, a lot of the cash rental rates are really tied to what we see for farm productivity. So whichever way we think that's going to go is going to drive rental rates going forward in the future. So first of all, let me kind of give you an idea of what's been going on with KFMA farm financials, because that's a kind of a good picture for what's been happening in the state. I'll talk a little bit about debt levels, interest costs, net farm income, and what the farm expenses may hold for the next year or so. If we look at our debt to asset ratios, really from a historical perspective, our debt to asset ratios are about the lowest they've ever been in the entire history of our KFMA program. That goes back about 50 years or so. So we're currently at debt to asset ratios in the eastern part of the state, center part of the state, below 20. That's really considered to be pretty good. Normally, 30 is probably a more common number here, and certainly back in the farm financial crisis of the 80s, we had debt to asset ratios of about got up to 45% or so, which was really, really way too high. So we're certainly in a better situation than what we were back then. But really, we can't really use the debt to asset ratio as a means to predict what may happen with the financial situation of farms because instead of being a predictor variable, it's really more of a trailing indicator. Usually by the time we see debt to asset ratios look bad, for a lot of farms have already been in trouble probably for a couple of years at that point. It turns out the first farm financial crisis, we had a lot of debt, but what really caused that was really just this big drop off in land values where land values declined by 30 or 40% over across the Midwest and Plains area. Even though debt did increase, it was that drop in asset values like that. So that's what makes it a trailing indicator. When farm situation gets really, really bad, that's when we'll start to see the drop in land values, and that will then start to have an effect on the debt to asset ratio. If we look at our KFMA balance sheet again, this looks very similar to Robin's picture for the national state of what's been happening there. We do see farms adding debt, which is this darker blue line right here. There is a slow increase of that. This lighter blue area here in the middle, this represents the amount of equity. A lot of that equity then is coming in from an increase in the land values. And if you add these two together, the equity and the farm debt together, then we get our total asset values right here at the top here. So our total asset values have been increasing really thanks to the fact that we've been seeing some pretty good increases in land values. And that really is what made our debt to asset ratios look really, really good. It's not the fact that farmers really have cut back on borrowing at all. It's the fact that land values have went up quite a bit. And you can see that more closely when we look at specifically our farm debt per acre. Now, this is a debt per acre per crop acre. So this would not only be on the own land, but also on land that they rent, basically the total size farm that they're farming. This graph is also only based on our grain farms. It excludes our mostly livestock farms from this here. So here's what we were back in the 80s here. On the eastern part of the state, we had about 225 farm debt per crop acre, about 175 here in central, and then maybe about 150 here in the west. And you can see what happened during the farm crisis of the 80s. This number dropped down as farmers really had to take on, if they wanted to have more land to farm, they really had to start renting at that point here. So this number came down. But ever since then, we have been increasing this almost every single year. We see some leveling off here in the center and the western part of the state. But right now in eastern Kansas, basically farms are carrying $400 per crop acre. And again, this includes not just own acres, but their land that they're renting here. So quite an increase in debt when you look at it just from this perspective. One good thing though is thanks to lower interest rates for the last decade or more, however long that has been, that has allowed us to really carry more debt than what we would otherwise. We're certainly not in a situation like we were back in the 80s where we had double-digit interest rates. And you kind of see the same thing reflected over on the general economy. Right now we have, what was it, $34 trillion in US debt here. Well, the reason we can actually support that, even though there's maybe some debate about whether we're actually doing that or not, is the fact that interest rates have certainly been lower than what they were several decades ago. And another reason why we may have added more to our debt is, farming has gotten more expensive. It certainly takes a lot more to put out a crop acre than what we had before. So there is probably some justification for running higher levels of debt, just because is more expensive to actually produce a crop. You have things like going out and buying a new combine that probably has a list price, probably of a close to $1 million. that's certainly going to affect farmers' ability to produce a crop unless they do take out some debt. Well, the flip side of that is, okay, debt levels have gone up. Well, what's been happening with the interest expense ratio? So the interest expense ratio measures the interest expense as a percent of the value of farm production. And value of farm production is really a measure of gross revenue that the farm brings in here. So normally we consider to be a 10% level to be a red flag level. So if you're bringing in $1 worth of, let's say, a crop revenue or livestock revenue, and you have to pay 10 cents off the top, which would be a 10% ratio, that's considered to be kind of a red flag area because that doesn't leave you much then to pay all your expenses, to have anything for family living, and pay for new machinery and stuff like that here. So that's always been considered to kind of be a big red flag. And you can see what happened back in the 80 farm crisis is, we had this ratio and some for the worst farms, but they had the most debt, they had ratios about 20%. That's not sustainable at that point in time. So this ratio has certainly dropped. A lot of this, though, has to do with the fact that the interest rates have also come down quite a bit. And right now, even though our debt levels are probably higher than they've ever been, this interest expense ratio has remained in pretty good shape, probably in the neighborhood of probably 5 to 7% across all three areas of the state here. And again, I have our lowest debt farms and our highest debt farms in here for the three regions. And that's not too bad. But the thing to remember is interest rates also have been fairly low here. If interest rates would ever increase again, then you're going to see a big increase in this interest expense ratio. So right now it's not too bad, but something to keep an eye on going forward. When the Farm Financial Standards actually put this set of ratios to look at together, because interest was such a big deal back then when we had double-digit interest rates, they actually made interest as a separate line item on the income statements so we can actually look at this a little more closer. Right now, we really have a whole generation of farmers out there who really haven't experienced double-digit interest rates. So, that's going to be a whole new ballgame from them if we ever get to a point where interest rates suddenly rise quite a bit. Um, this graph looks at the average interest rates. So with the KFMA data, I'm actually able to take a look at their total debt picture and their total amount of interest paid, and I can calculate basically an average interest expense. As you'll see on the next slide, really the KFMA numbers for the amount of interest that farmers are paying really matches pretty close to prime rate here. And you can see we're at near historic levels for that here. So currently we're paying about maybe 4 to 4.5% average interest rate on all debt that they have out there. And again, this matches the prime rate pretty close here. You can see there's certainly more variability in the prime rate, but this number has tracked down just as the prime rate has tracked down. But you'll notice over the last year or two, this rate has started to go up quite a bit. In fact, this last summer it got up to about 8.5%. I think right now it's about 7.5%. So I really expect the interest expense on most KFMA farms to kind of start to go back up again, just because historically it has tracked fairly close to this here. So you start to see a little bit of this happening right here. Again, going down in future years here, unless our prime rate comes down, I really expect the interest expense number on most KFMA farms to go up over the next year or two. When we look at the interest per crop acre again, even though we have more debt than we ever have, again, this number has stayed fairly constant really since about 1990 or so here. So it's certainly not a very bad problem looking at it just as when you put this on a per crop acre basis. But again, higher interest rates would make this go up again too. Well, what about net farm income? So again, in a perfect world here, when you're looking to sign maybe a 3 to 5 year cash rental rate, that cash rental rate really should reflect the productivity you see happening over the next 3 to 5 years as well. But again, it's really kind of hard to predict exactly what's going to happen with net farm income. I kind of feel comfortable when I do my net farm income estimates for Kansas to maybe forecast out a year, possibly 2 years at the most. But really, if you go beyond that, it becomes very a bit of a problem to actually make good estimates about that. So I go back and look at the historical data to some degree because the past really is kind of a good predictor of what's going to happen in the future for the most part, in the absence of any other information. So I kind of look at a combination of what I think is going to happen with net farm income over the next year, maybe possibly 2 years, and then maybe the last couple of years to kind of help balance that out with the idea that that past is going to kind of drive what's going to happen in the future here. And if you get, and Robin showed a similar graph to this here for the net farm income, but I have broken this out across the three regions. I've had the median value, the mean value, and then the lowest 25% and the highest 25%. You can see it's very, very common with our KFMA farms for the median value to be higher than the median value. So the median value is the number in the middle when you take all the net farm incomes and rank them in order, whereas the mean is just the average here. We have enough bigger farms that they help pull up the overall median values that you would otherwise see here. One thing you'll notice is, net farm income was really fairly stable from about 1980 or maybe about 1990 to about early 2000. And then we started to see a lot more spikes in our net farm income, a lot more variability where we see some really pretty good high net farm incomes and we go back to some pretty lows here. And then about 2020 here, we really saw some really good net farm income for a year or two, and then it has certainly dropped back down to what we currently see right now. When you look at that on a per crop acre basis, there's going to be an idea, well, if I had this net farm income, what could I translate that to a crop acre basis to pay for cash rent? You can see how much the variability has been when has changed here. You basically from in 2015, you really didn't have anything left over to pay cash rental rates to whereas in 2020, we were making in the eastern part of the state about $200 per acre that could have gone to cash rental rates here. So it's really kind of hard to say, well, what should be the next cash rental rate for the next 3 to 5 years when we do see such volatility happening like this. And say here's why I think using the past to some degree may be a good idea for the using in the future here. So when I did my net farm income forecast back in August, I was basically predicting 2024 net farm income was going to be in the range of about $45,000, which is really historically over the last decade or so is really a pretty low number here. But notice here when I made that forecast, grain prices were probably about the lowest point of the year here. And that was also reflected in the future prices that I was using here. So I certainly think net farm income is going to be higher than what I predicted back in August of this last year. It's probably not going to be maybe quite as high as what it was a couple of years ago, but it's probably certainly going to be better than the $45,000 I'm predicting here because we're currently looking at corn, $5 and wheat at $6 here. And again, we throw that in some emergency payments in there too here. So probably 2025 is certainly looking better than what I had first envisioned back about a year ago or so here. Now, the question we ask is, are we ever going to have a case where we're going to have $8 corn and $16 soybeans, again, where we had those record high net farm incomes? And I guess my short answer would be yes, someday we're going to see $8 corn and $16 soybeans. I can almost guarantee that will happen. The trouble is, I don't know when that's going to happen here. If I could predict when it was going to happen, I would certainly not be presenting up here today. I would be out in the futures market, making a lot of money here. But I can almost guarantee that the past will be repeated again somewhere down in the future. Maybe several years down the road, or maybe decades down the road. Who knows? But this will happen again somewhere down the future. I can pretty much guarantee it. Well, what about input costs? I think this is really the one positive side about maybe agriculture for the next couple of years. I think we have stopped the increase for the most part. This is the USDA price indexes since about last year. You can see here's the rate of inflation right here, which is about maybe 2 to 2.5%. Practically every one of our major expense categories actually has increased less than the rate of inflation, and in some cases it has actually decreased over the last year. Included in that would be fuels, which are a bit down about 7%. We have fertilizer down about 3%, and labor is actually showing a little bit lower too here, although I kind of maybe question how the USDA does this particular survey for this number here. That and the seeds make me a little suspect for those two, but the other ones I think track pretty close here. So that's good from that perspective. If we look at it though from more of a 5-year perspective, it's not quite as good as what that 1-year perspective showed here. Here again, here's the rate of inflation over the last 5 years. Overall prices haven't increased about 20%. Well, it turns out every single expense item for farms has increased more than that. Fertilizer, when we got over $1,000 anhydrous prices was showing up here, it has since calmed down, but it's still a lot lower than what it was back here. So, I think anymore that, $700 anhydrous may be our bottom point going forward here. And I'm not sure we're ever going to get to a point where we're going to see $400 anhydrous again, like maybe we saw back in this period back here. So it's a little more discouraging from a 5-year perspective, but again, from a 1-year number, things are looking a lot better than what they were last year at this time. Doing some forecasting for some of the other major input prices, fuel and fertilizer in particular here. Here's been the last year of diesel and gasoline prices. You have seen basically a slow decrease in diesel prices over the last year, maybe a little bit of run up over the last month or two, but generally it's lower than what it was last year. Gasoline tends to follow this overall pattern where we peak in the summertime about Memorial Day. It stays high during the summer and then it goes back down. But really, gas prices are almost identical to where they were last year here. I think the important thing to keep in mind for farmers is, well, what's this difference between gas and diesel? At one time, that spread between those fuels was actually pretty constant. If you go back far enough, actually diesel fuel at one time used to be cheaper than what the gasoline price was. That hadn't been that way for, 5, 10 or more years now that way. We almost always see diesel at a higher price. Part of that is due to the refinery capacity in the U.S. It tends to be a little bit low. So we get a little constrained on how much fuel we can produce. This has been the pattern I've seen for the last 2 years here, US, as far as that premium to diesel to gas. It tends to be higher here in the wintertime. It tends to go down in the summertime and it slowly rises again. So right now, if you look at the fuel prices, I think we're going to follow a similar pattern here. I think at some point here in the next month or two, you're going to start to see this price premium go down. So we may have reached a higher point for diesel prices for the year. Maybe that might tend to go down for the coming year. My forecast for diesel prices would actually kind of reflect that. Here we are right now. Here's my forecast for the next 12 months for diesel fuel prices with my kind of my standard error for what the forecast might be. You can see basically I'm predicting probably about a 30 to 40 cent decrease in diesel prices over the coming year, as long as things don't change too much. Right now there's a lot of uncertainty in the world, certainly in Russia and Ukraine, what's been happening politically here. So I don't guarantee this, but based on the best of data that I have, I'm predicting diesel prices to come down. I just got done running a fertilizer model a couple days ago, so I'm in the process of writing that up here. But this is kind of been my basic model. This is what my most recent model is. But this model really hasn't changed a whole lot here, where I'm basically using oil, corn, and inflation as a way to predict what I think I may see happening for anhydrous fertilizer prices. You can see here's where we are right now with probably about 725 for anhydrous. I'm basically expecting anhydrous probably to go up a little bit, probably because higher corn price is a little higher. I think I plugged in about a 4% inflation rate on my model here. So that's why I'm predicting maybe anhydrous actually may go up during the summer, may reach a point, probably maybe in the 850 range or so towards later on during the year if my forecasts for inflation and corn kind of hold here. So that's where I'm looking at to go. I don't really think we're ever going to get down to the 400 range again. We have probably actually have seen now probably the low point for anhydrous prices for the year, um, probably about June or July or August of 2024. I think we're going to probably see maybe a slow rise in anhydrous prices going forward.
Hey, Greg, I'll just break in. There's a couple of questions in the chat that might be relevant to go ahead and just take care of now from
Okay.
Jennifer and Amanda.
Let's see. I can't see the.
I can read it if you want to.
Yeah, I can't. My chat went away here. I don't know what happened to it,
Okay,
but
the first one, what happens if Canada turns off the taps for potash and oil in response to the political environment?
okay. Um, so oil and potash, those are very much fungible commodities here. So those kind of things really aren't going to happen. I mean, Canada can make it rougher for us to get oil and the potash. But really, I mean, if they sell to another country, that we can always backdoor it and come in some other way. So I don't really look at those things being as too effective. Certainly, we actually produce enough oil in the U.S. for our own needs. What's really happening in the oil situation is that we're set up in the U.S. to refine heavyweight oils. A lot of those oils coming from Canada are heavyweight oils. Other countries can't process those. So it works out better for Canada to send us their heavyweight oils, and we actually export a fair number of the lighter weight oils, which are easier to process here. So I don't think if Canada says they're going to shut off oil, I don't think that's going to do a single thing to fuel prices. Potash could make it more expensive just because we'll have to come in some other ways to bring potash in. But even then, I don't think you're looking at much of a damage for the fertilizer potash price.
And the other question, Is this message the same if the tariffs do come through? I'd be interested to see predictions for input costs with the 25% tariffs.
Yeah, again, it depends on what we're having. Oops, it depends on what we're having to bring in. Whoops, draw when we're having to bring in from outside the U.S., that could certainly affect machinery prices. Trump at one time threatened to put for Deere to put a what do you say, like 100 to 200% tariff on stuff coming in from Mexico. So that certainly has the potential to make things higher. But as far as anhydrous fertilizer, you can make that basically from natural gas, and we have a lot of natural gas here in the U.S. So yeah, certainly some inputs I think tend to be higher, but again, some of them won't be. Just really depends on how much stuff is actually made outside the U.S. So I would look at probably machinery probably being the biggest thing that's going to be affected there when we look at what the input costs might be. All right, so we go back to
Yeah,
my
thanks. That's all we have
presentation.
for now.
Okay. All right. So a little more detail on my net farm income prediction. Again, back when I was doing this back in August, I was kind of predicting lower net farm income. This has certainly changed some, so it's not quite as dire as what I had here. The one thing that does concern me a little bit is this percent of farms that may lose money. I think it's a fairly significant number, even in the better years. So that always bears watching is these farms on the margin, what may happen there. If we look at our crop budgets for this last year, this is a screenshot I took from my leasing tool, crop budget and leasing tool that should be available under Ag Manager under the crop budget section. You can see I put kind of five random crop budgets from different areas of the state here. And you can see what the return above direct expenses are, which means those variable expenses that you have to pay if you want to actually have positive cash flow. You can see those numbers are down quite a bit here. So I think most farms can still cash flow without any problem. I don't see that being an issue. But long-term profitability, I think, is certainly going to be something to worry about. There's no cash rent built into this number overall expenses here right now. So I don't really have a land charge in this. And even taking that out, you can see our Southwest wheat budget is still showing negative returns overall total expenses here, even without having a land charge in there. So that's certainly not a good long-term profitability situation based on with what happened with land prices, I mean, with grain prices over the last year. Cash leasing for farm ground, that is a big deal for most farmers. You can see that about the typical farm leases about 70% of their ground or so. And we only have about maybe 5 to 10% of our farms who don't lease anything at all, which is this red line down here. So it's very important to practically every farm in the state. Um, and certainly since you're renting a big portion of your ground, that cost to rent ground is going to be very, very important. We provide every fall in about September, October, I provide a leasing publication where I estimate cash leases for both dry land and irrigated ground. And we do this as a way to counterbalance the NASS survey of rental rates here. And the number we put out shouldn't be taken as the number that you should insist on to use for a rental rate. Basically just a starting point in the whole lease negotiation thing here. So keep that in mind here. I have a lot of people call me saying, "Well, your cash rental rate for our county was $50 here, and I'm only paying 40 to 5." And I have to explain to people, no, that's really just a starting point. I mean, you can make cases whether it should be higher or whether it should be lower here. And just depending on how well the tenant and landlord can agree to negotiation, it may go up or it may go down from that number we actually publish. So don't look at that as a magic number that what we publish here. So NAST, they also do a survey. They do a survey like this time of year every year, and they publish their results at the end of August. And that's basically a survey of tenants, and it's their average rental rate for all land that they have under lease here. So it may not be the most current numbers in there. As a result, the NAST number really tends to lag quite a bit for what's happening with current rental rates out there. When we did this publication for rental rates, we actually look at the productivity and profitability of the ground based on KFMA numbers here. So our number is going to be different. I think our number tends to be more current than what NAS has. And in fact, if you look at this last year, NAS actually showed an increase in their both their non-irrigated and their irrigated cropland rental rates, whereas in my lease publication, for the most of the counties, I think I showed a little bit of a decrease here. So NAS is still playing catch up with the what's been happening in recent farm productivity, where I think my number is a little bit closer here. And actually, my numbers and the NAS numbers, they probably about as close as they've ever been as far as when I've done these publications. I mean, there's some differences here, but in the grand scheme of things, I think it's really pretty close when we look at the different regions of the state. Going forward, I really expect the NAS number maybe to start coming down a little bit. I think my numbers are going to hold probably pretty steady for the next year, depending upon what the next year looks like as far as productivity. But if I had to say right now, I would say lease rates for 2026 are probably going to be pretty close to what I have in this current publication for this coming year. And you can see if you look at our land rental publications, our NAG manager, you can see what our rental rates are. As Robin pointed out, this northeast corner of Kansas, it's almost like a whole different world here when it comes to land values. And you can say the same thing for cash rental rates up here because we have some rental rates that I'm predicting really should be above $200 per acre. You know, that's stuff you see like in Illinois rental rates in some parts of the states here when you compare that to like the western part of the state here. So certainly kind of reflects kind of the land value, I think, on the color coded basis with the higher rates up here and the lower rates down over here. And then the publication also has an ask survey again. So there's 204 numbers are the numbers they publish in August. The number I publish and probably about a month later, the 205 is kind of the forward-looking number I really expect to see show up for the coming year here. So they're kind of done about the same time. I'm just calling mine the 202, 2025 estimate. They also do the same thing for the irrigated ground. I'm assuming that I use corn production under center pivot irrigation as my assumptions when I develop this. And I'm able to come up with an irrigated rental rate for practically every county in the state that does have some irrigated ground here. One thing I think where I have a big advantage over this rental rate publication is that NAS is not able to produce near as many numbers because, again, they are doing a survey approach. They can only publish surveys if they have enough survey response to publish something here. You can see, so they're missing a big chunks of the state by not by doing a survey thing where I don't have that limitation. I can fill that back in with my numbers. I really expect at some point in the future, based on what's been happening in DC these days, that these county level surveys may go away from NAS here, and we may not actually have those here. So my number may be the only number going forward at some point in time. Just some tips for landlords and tenants about things. So I get questions both from landlords and tenants about cash rental rate numbers. I try to be fair to both sides here. So, if a landlord calls me, I will be, and typically the calls I get from landlords are someone who they've been paying the same rental rate for the last 5 years, and they want to know, well, am I behind what I'm paying? Well, it's almost always a given that they're behind on what the current rental rates probably are. So I tell landlords, well, here's the number we have. Maybe you want to talk to your tenant and discuss about why things really haven't changed, and maybe talk about recent productivity and just come up with some reasons for why it would be higher, possibly. On the tenant side, if I get a tenant calling me about maybe changes to the rental rate, I can say, look, well, here's what productivity has been. This is maybe why the rental rates have gone down. Maybe going forward, you don't see productivity being all that well. You can use that as your negotiating point with your landlord to say that maybe you don't think productivity is as good as what it has been. And again, if you're a tenant, you can also say, you can talk about how well you've done managing the farm and those kind of things there. So a lot of information kind of goes into this. It's kind of a give and take. I would argue, though, that tenants probably do have somewhat of an advantage in negotiation because they're usually the ones with a better source of information about what's been happening out there in the farm economy here. So that gives them a little bit, I think, more power in the negotiating side of things. But really, you should make everyone happy in the whole process. Neither the landlord nor the tenant should walk away thinking that they're being forced into signing something that what they're not comfortable with. So if you can walk away from an agreement, both landlords and tenants are happy, that's considered to be a fair lease here. So that's really what we're shooting for in this whole idea of coming up with a fair rental rate for between a tenant and landlord is you just be happy with what you have, and both parties should be happy in the discussion. So again, if you got questions, be glad to entertain those, but you can also follow me on Twitter. I also put some stuff up on Substack too, so maybe you want to check that out as well. So what kind of questions might you have?
Greg, I have a question that came to me actually. And what is Substack? Do you want to explain a little what that is that you just mentioned?
Oh, Substack. Yeah, that's one of these online writing publications. So some of the stuff I'm just kind of testing out. Um, I publish it there first just to kind of see what kind of reaction I get. So I publish a little more about the general economy and some of those things too there. So if you go to this web address, agricultural.substack.com, that will take you to my Substack where I publish some of the stuff. But most of my stuff ends up on Ag Manager anyway, but sometimes I put it up here first. There was a question about how much data on cash basis versus share crop. I don't know if I have a good handle for that. Um,
We did answer that
Robin
in
and I,
the
yeah.
chat. Yeah,
oh, do you
Greg,
do you just okay? All right.
there's a survey that's done every 4 years, I believe it is, and specific to non-irrigated crop ground, and that breaks it out into crop share, cash rent. You see, I put at the state level, that's about 40% each. The balance of that would be flexible cash rent, net share, where you're sharing in the crop but not the expenses, and then some other kind of newer type lease structures that are out there. But that does vary by region. So if you go to that publication, you can look regionally across the state what leases are in different types of structures.
Oh, I should point out too that if you are interested in comparing like a share lease with a cash lease, my crop budget and leasing tool actually allows you to make that comparison. So pull that up off of our our cash rental rate publication and look at, or I mean, I guess that's actually on our budget publication and look at that and you can get an idea of making the comparison.
This is our last week for this series. We'll have some more stuff going on as we go through the spring here, but this is the last in this particular series. Next week, Dan O'Brien has a grain marketing webinar again on Monday. And we'll probably be having a Ukraine webinar here sometime. Antonina Broyaka has been pretty busy with a bunch of stuff. She's been traveling to that part of the world some, and she's also teaching, but we'll probably have something like that along the way. Well, I'm not seeing anything else. Greg, thank you. Robin, thank you. And glad to have you all on. We appreciate it and look forward to catching you down the road sometime.